Welcome to TM News. Russia has admitted suffering significant losses of troops in Ukraine as the invasion enters its 44th day. Presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov told British channel Sky News the casualties were a huge tragedy for us. He said he hoped Moscow would reach its war goals in the coming days. Mr. Peskov's comments followed Russia's expulsion from the United Nations Human Rights Council on Wednesday. Some 93 of the 193 members of the Union General Assembly voted in favor of the diplomatic rebuke, which followed allegations of mass human rights abuses by Russian troops in the formerly occupied town of Bucha in northern Ukraine. Moscow announced its resignation from the council in response. The body expressed its grave concern at the ongoing human rights and humanitarian crisis, and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russia of further atrocities in Borodyanka, a town near the capital Kiev. Mr. Peskov denied any suggestion that Russian troops were responsible for executions in the town of Bucha and told the broadcaster that, "We're living in days of fakes and lies." He baselessly claimed that images of civilians murdered in the town were staged. However, his admission that Russia has suffered significant casualties is striking. On March 25, Russia's Ministry of Defense said 1,351 of its soldiers had been killed in combat. Ukraine puts the Russian deaths at almost 19,000. Neither Russia nor Ukraine's estimates of Russian losses can be independently verified, and analysts have cautioned that Russia may be downplaying its casualty rate, while Ukraine could be inflating it to boost morale. Western leaders believe that between 7,000 and 15,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. Mr. Peskov, who has served as Russian President Vladimir Putin's spokesperson since 2000, also claimed that Russia is searching for ways to end the war. "Our military are doing their best to bring an end to that operation," he said. "And we do hope that in coming days, in the foreseeable future, this operation will reach its goals or will finish it by the negotiations between Russian and Ukrainian delegation." Russia has pulled troops away from Kiev and shifted most of the focus of its war to eastern Ukraine, but the fighting shows no signs of ending. Ukraine's deputy prime minister has urged Ukrainians living in the east to flee while they still can, and the intensity of the shelling there is already hampering evacuations. On Thursday, Western nations imposed further sanctions on the Russian economy in retaliation for alleged war crimes in Ukraine. The U.S. Senate voted unanimously to remove Moscow's most favored nation trade status, opening the door to damaging new tariffs and import controls on products like platinum, chemicals, iron, and steel. And the EU agreed to gradually impose a ban on imports of Russian coal, worth around $4 billion a year to the Russian economy, over the next 120 days. Speaking to Russia's parliament, the State Duma, Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin admitted that the cumulative impact of extensive sanctions means the country is facing its worst economic outlook in decades. "No doubt, the current situation could be called the most difficult in 3 decades for Russia," he said. Such sanctions were not used even in the darkest times of the Cold War. But he claimed that the impact of Western sanctions has been limited, telling MPs that the financial system, the lifeblood of the entire economy, has held up. After collapsing to a historic low at the end of February, Russia's currency, the ruble, has rebounded to its pre-war level. Ukraine's President Zelensky has renewed his calls for fresh supplies of heavy weapons from the West, saying his forces need weapons which will give it the means to win on the battlefield and that will be the strongest possible sanction against Russia. Azovstal wounded carried on stretchers. Russian media are reporting that large numbers of Ukrainian fighters are still inside the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol. Drone footage posted on social media shows people on stretchers being carried away from the steelworks earlier this week. The BBC can't independently verify the date on which the images were recorded. How is the war affecting global food supplies? The UN is now calling it another war within Russia's war in Ukraine. In the country once described as the world's food basket, fighting is now stopping food supplies to feed Ukraine and the world. A country which represented more than 10% of the world's cereal exports is now exporting a trickle, warns Matthew Hollingworth, the World Food Programme's new emergency coordinator in Ukraine. We're seeing a potential impact on 400 million people around the world who would eat bread with wheat grown in this country, he says. Food prices have shot up around the world, including in places like Afghanistan and Yemen, where millions were on the brink of starvation even before Russia invaded Ukraine in February. Russian attacks along the Black Sea coast, including Ukraine's main port in Odessa, are strangling trade flows in and out of the country. Speaking to the BBC in the Ukrainian capital Kiev, Hollingworth warns, "You always believe it can't get any worse. Unfortunately, we know it can always get worse." Ukrainians don embroidered shirts for Vyshyvanka Day. On a lighter note, Ukraine is marking Vyshyvanka Day today, a celebration of the traditional Ukrainian embroidered shirt. It is one of the best-known symbols of Ukrainian culture, with roots reaching back several centuries. Classic Vyshyvankas boast exquisite, usually floral, patterns down the middle of the front. Some of these patterns carry a meaning of their own, such as hope, love, chastity, fertility, protection against disease or the evil eye. Different Ukrainian regions have patterns peculiar to them. The original Vyshyvanka is white, but now they are available in almost any color imaginable. Russian soldier confronted by widow in war crimes trial. The trial of Vadim Shishamarin began today with a powerful encounter between the Russian tank commander and the widow of the man he killed. Katerina Shilapova stood up in court and asked the 21-year-old what he had felt when he killed her husband Alexander, and did he repent his crime. The soldier replied that he admitted his guilt and asked for her forgiveness. "But I understand you won't be able to forgive me," he added. Katerina Shilapova hadn't finished. "Tell me please, why did you come here?" "To protect us," she asked, citing Vladimir Putin's justification for the invasion of Ukraine. "Protect us from whom? Did you protect me from my husband, whom you killed?" The soldier had no answer to that. Perhaps such raw encounters are what such war crimes trials are about, at least in part. Forcing a soldier, who ignored all the rules of war, to face up to exactly what he has done and the pain he has caused. Yesterday, Katerina told me she actually felt sorry for him, but she could not forgive him for this crime. She heard the shots that killed her husband, then saw Sgt Shishamarin through her gate, holding his weapon. A little later she found Alexander's body in the street. "The loss of my husband is everything for me," Katerina said, adding, "He was my protector." Vadim Shishamarin claims that he hadn't wanted to fire the fatal shots, that he was following orders, threatened by another soldier, if he refused to do as he was told. Hundreds of POWs registered from Azovstal plant. Red Cross. The International Committee of the Red Cross says it has registered hundreds of Ukrainian prisoners of war from the Azovstal plant in Mariupol. Registration involves filling out a form with personal details like name, date of birth and closest relative. The information is used to track those who have been captured and helps the organization keep in touch with families. In a statement, the organization says the registration process began on Tuesday and is ongoing. It also says that the ICRC is not involved in transporting POWs to the places where they are held. Under the Geneva Convention, the ICRC says, it must continue to have access to POWs and be allowed to interview them without witnesses, and the duration and frequency of visits should not be unduly restricted. Russia says more than 900 Ukrainian fighters from the Mariupol steelworks have been taken to a former prison colony, in a Russian-controlled part of Donetsk. Mariupol, will those still trapped fight or surrender? There are conflicting reports about the number of fighters who have surrendered from the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol, and confusion too about how many remain inside. Russia has just said another 771 have left, taking the total to 1,730. But numbers have always been a bit uncertain in the battle for this strategically crucial southern port. Until recently there were said to have been 2,000 Ukrainian fighters holding out. If we take the Russian claim of the total who have surrendered, that could mean a few hundred are still inside the labyrinthine tunnels of the steel plant. Indeed, pro-Russian media have said the leaders of the Azov battalion are yet to surrender. This controversial unit of the Ukrainian armed forces is a bête noire of the Russians, featuring prominently in Kremlin propaganda. Russia accuses them of being Nazis, something Ukraine has always denied. Meanwhile, some Russian lawmakers have said they should be treated as war criminals rather than prisoners of war. Vyacheslav Volodin, the Speaker of the Duma, Russia's parliament, said, "Nazi criminals should not be exchanged." One prominent MP even said the death penalty should be reintroduced to deal with them. Leonid Slutsky, who had previously taken part in negotiations with Ukraine, called them animals in human form. Given this context, it may be that surrender becomes an increasingly less attractive offer for who remain. The question is, what do they plan to do instead?